Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is nuclear power. I'll explain. Shabtai Shavit is the former head of the Israeli Mossad. Mossad is the Israeli equivalent of the CIA in the United States, or MI6 in Great Britain, the United Kingdom. For years, the identity of the Mossad personnel, past and present, remained a guarded secret. But times have changed, and Shavit recently granted an interview to the Times of Israel. Now, when the head of the Mossad, or a former head of the Mossad, speaks, it's always worth paying attention to, no matter what he says. And it's not about the intel he discloses, because that might be old, obviously. It's about the analysis. And as part of his job, the most important role that he played was actually the Mossad heads brief the Prime Minister daily on threats and nuances of threats and the potential for future threats facing Israel. The head of Mossad lays out all potential and future threats and advances plans on how to disrupt the blueprints for attacks that their enemies have constructed against Israel itself. In this interview, the most important item that Shavit dissected was Iran's nuclear interest and nuclear program. In his estimation, and this is important, try as they might, try as they are doing, Israel cannot prevent Iran from attaining nuclear weapons and joining the nuclear weapons club. Under umbrella of the nuclear weapons, you should note, are also non-conventional weapons like ballistic missiles, biological weapons, chemical weapons, and cyber weapons. In fact, Shavit emphasizes that cyber weapons are very much a part of the nuclear non-conventional army. Iran is committed to attaining nukes and other weapons. They want these weapons, Shavit explained, not to immediately use against Israel, which is Israel's worst defense nightmare, you should note. Iran wants the weapons to ensure Iranian safety and to expand Iranian influence and power. Shavit said, and I'm quoting here, "I am not one of those who say that the moment they, that is the Iranians, have a bomb, they will physically threaten Israel's existence. No, but a state with a bomb can use it to create all kinds of axes of influence to advance its interest," unquote. Once any country, and certainly Iran is included in this axiom, has these powerful nuclear capabilities, they are viewed very differently in the world of foreign affairs. Power and cachet increases exponentially, and a nuclear strong and capable country like Iran becomes a magnet that attracts other countries and other organizations and industries. Shavit asserted that Iran's decisions to fiercely pursue military prowess were shaped by their 8-year war with Iraq. He said, and I'm quoting here again, they, that is the Iranians, didn't emerge with flying colors from the 8-year Iran-Iraq war in the 80s. The results of the war were the trigger for the Iranians to make the strategic decision to go for the whole gamut of non-conventional weapons, not only nuclear. Nuclear, ballistic missiles, chemical weapons, biological, cyber. Cyber, too, in professional terminology, is part of the non-conventional armory, unquote. I trust Shabtai Shavit. I trust his instincts and his expertise. After obtaining a nuke, Iran's first move will not be to launch against Israel. But that in no way means that Israel can breathe a proverbial sigh of relief. It means that Israel and all those whom Iran considers to be enemies, and the list is long, must devise a defense strategy that plans for a potential strike for a worst-case scenario. Nuclear weapons signify power. Iran craves power. Israel's possession of a nuclear weapon is an open secret. No other country is supposed to know, but every country knows. Say what they will, Iran does not want nuclear technology for energy. They want nukes because nukes are a military muscle that they want, and the military and diplomatic machismo nuclear power brings. Diplomatically speaking, Iran is insulted that the United States and other Western countries patronize them and have decided that Iran may not have nukes. And that makes Iran's devotion to pursue and obtain strong nuclear arsenals even stronger. To spite the West, and especially the United States, Iran wants not just to have nukes, but to sell and distribute them to whomever they want and whoever comes knocking at their door. And that is where Iran becomes even more dangerous. They have no compunction about selling or supplying nuclear arms to any country who desires, or terrorist organizations, by the way, the same exact ideal. Now, that is the real power that Iran pursues. Non-conventional weapons will be a huge potential industry for Iran, and they will export weapons and technology. Nuclear plants and nuclear energy is much less in demand than our nuclear weapons. And with that power, Iran dreams to become the leader of an alliance of all the countries that despise, as they do, the United States and Israel. That is Iran's real goal in obtaining nukes. The threat to Israel, if Iran becomes a member of the nuclear club, is real. But that threat is not simply to Israel. The threat is to the entire world. There are a lot of countries that have a lot of enemies out there, and those countries and those organizations are the friends and the clients of the very dangerous Iran. I've also been thinking about threats that Israel faces, other threats. Israel, let's say, for instance, will continue to intercept Hezbollah and dash their attempts to build up a force that can attack Israel from Syria. Defense Minister Benny Gantz has issued a clear threat to Hezbollah terror groups overlooking the northern border, saying that Israel will keep preventing Shiite terror groups' efforts to entrench in Syria. He said, and I'm quoting here, and this is an important quote, "We will continue to ensure our security interests, which include removing Iranian entrenchment in Syria, blocking the transfer of advanced weapons, and preventing the development of precision-guided missiles anywhere in the region, in Syria or in Lebanon." According to Gantz, and he continues, "The situation in Lebanon and Syria is not good, not economically, coronavirus-wise, or infrastructure. I remind Syria and Lebanon that they are responsible for all that happens within their borders, and we will demand them to uphold it. We are not looking for unnecessary flare-ups, but those who test us will be met with our superior capabilities," unquote. Very powerful statement. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from ynet.com, and it's by Nachman Shai. It's entitled, "As U.S. Veers Left, Israel Swerves Right." Shai was a member of Knesset. He made his name as the spokesman for the army during the Iraqi war, when almost every single Israeli was glued to their television and sitting in sealed rooms wearing gas masks and listening to Nachman Shai. He was the voice of calm in a major crisis. His point is very simple in his essay. The U.S. is changing and moving left, while Israel is moving right. It is essential for Israel to reach out to new members of Congress and get their support. This is how Shai begins. It's doubtful many people in the United States, perhaps a handful, had heard of Jamal Bowman until recently, but it's worth taking note of his name. In New York, people had heard little of him, though in New York's 16th Congressional District, which encompasses northern Bronx and southern half of Westchester County, he's probably better known today. Last weekend, Bowman defeated influential Democrat Eliot Engel, the serving U.S. representative for New York's 16th District for the past 31 years, and current chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs in the party primary, unquote. Now, Shai gives perspective, explaining that the United States is in revolutionary mode, toppling statues and toppling the establishment. He writes, Bowman beat Engel, a Jewish 73-year-old Israel supporter who recently led the impeachment process of U.S. President Donald Trump with his House colleague Adam Schiff. At the most defining moment, nothing helped Engel, who has been washed away by the same tidal wave now sweeping across the United States in general, and the Democratic Party in particular. shrugging off the establishment, shaking up the current order, and moving towards a new future. This is democracy. The wave of protests has moved to the political arena and translates into personal and ideological changes across the board. It's hard to underestimate the power of the revolution sweeping across the United States right now. The statues of heroes of the United States, South, historic military and civilian leaders, the Confederate flag, symbols of government like the police, are all being thrown to the curb, literally. Engel was a friend of Israel for 31 years in Congress. All of his 31 years in Congress. He was also chair of the all-powerful House Committee on Foreign Affairs. The committee had a huge influence on policy because it controlled the purse strings of the foreign affairs issues, which is the most important part of foreign policy. Now Shai tries to explain just how important it is for the Israeli leadership to step up and court these new U.S. Democrats. He writes, currently, the Democrats control the House of Representatives. If they do well in the election in 14 weeks, they could take the White House or the Senate or both. The foreign minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, said recently that in the current coalition, his Blue and White Party has a hand on the wheel and a foot on the brakes. Well, the time for him to demonstrate his driving skills is almost upon us. Israel under Netanyahu is approaching an historic turning point. Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020, when he reaches it, Netanyahu will have to decide whether to turn right or left. His tendency is likely to turn to the right, and it is equally likely that someone will have to pull a steering wheel the other way. This will be the job of the co-driver, Gabi Ashkenazi, to ensure that the car does not get driven off the road altogether. Now Nachman Shai not only offers important insight, he offers a plan of action. That is an important element of the essay that he wrote. Next up is a column by Dan Diker. Diker was the head of the World Jewish Congress, which is the umbrella organization that represents the Jewish communities all over the world, over 100 countries. He is now a foreign policy fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. This piece comes from Israel Hayom and was published first on the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs website. The column actually is entitled, and this is important to recognize, because this emphasizes the topic, does BDS-BLM alignment threaten diaspora Jewry? What Diker emphasizes is that the increasingly mainstreamed BDS-BLM narrative poses a grave danger to the United States and Europe, as progressive and liberal Jewish communities are being threatened by this marriage between these two groups. This is how Diker begins. The murder of George Floyd, a Black American who was killed on May 25th while in police custody in Minneapolis, triggered the most widespread racial charged protest in the United States and Europe since the 1960s. Diker now describes how Jewish leadership expressed universal condemnation for the police brutality and support for BLM. Yet it did not stop a rash of anti-Semitic attacks that followed. He writes, Jewish leaders have similarly demonstrated solidarity in the spirit of the 1960s Black Jewish unity and the Civil Rights Movement. American Jewish leaders unequivocally condemned the Floyd killing. World Jewish Congress President Ronald Lauder denounced it as a horrific racist act. The Union for Reform Judaism issued a statement that read, Black Lives Matter is a Jewish value. The Orthodox Jewish Union, the OU, declared, racism is not a thing of the past or simply a political issue. It is a real and present danger that must be met head on. The Anti-Defamation League director, Jonathan Greenblatt, declared, we stand in solidarity with the Black community as they yet again are subject to pain and suffering at the hands of a racist and unjust system. Diker tries to explain, and this is important, the attacks and the vitriol directed at Jews and the Jewish community in the aftermath of what happened, despite the Jewish condemnations. These are his words. Despite universal Jewish support for BLM, It failed to prevent a surge of anti-Semitic violence across the United States in the aftermath of the Floyd murder. Jewish store owners were assaulted. Jewish-owned stores and restaurants were defaced and looted. Social media has been rife with anti-Semitic libel denouncing the Jewish state and delegitimizing Jews. In Fairfax neighborhood of Los Angeles, demonstrators were heard screaming, "Kill the Jews." Synagogues were defaced with graffiti reading "F Israel, Free Palestine." Diker explains that there is a marriage between the BDS and BLM, and that's important. He explains that BLM has used this crisis in the United States to cement the link between the assertion of the oppression of the Palestinians by Israel and the BLM argument that the United States is inherently racist. This link is powerful in the eyes of those who subscribe. He asserts that if unchallenged, this marriage could be the greatest threat to Israel since 1948. This is how Diker writes it. This inversion of history is a necessary reconstruction to anchor the allegations against Israel of white supremacism, imperialism, and settler colonialism. This assault against the historical and international legal legitimacy of the nation of the Jewish people also delegitimizes, criminalizes, and dehumanizes diaspora Jews by extension. According to the BDS-BLM narrative, any Jew who supports Israel's existence is automatically branded a racist robber of Palestinian land. If left unchallenged and uncorrected, this increasingly mainstreamed and radicalized narrative poses one of the greatest dangers to American and European progressive and liberal Jewish communities since the end of the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. This is a very powerful argument Diker presents, and he is 100% correct. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 3 cartoons today. They all jab at Corona, and we have to laugh more. Laughter is a wonderful tool. It's also a healing mechanism, which is powerful, not just for community, families, but for individuals. Laughter is important. This first cartoon is a play on which is the worst number. Actually, the issue is not which is the worst number, but rather which is the number which is most unlucky. So the number 13 says, "I'm the worst number." Then 666, which is the number of the devil, chimes in saying, "No, I am." And 2020 just sits there and laughs. Next up is a campaign poster for Inigo Montoya, the year 2020. Remember, it's a campaign poster. All of you should remember that Inigo Montoya, and we've spoken about this here on the show, was that amazing character played by Mandy Patinkin in the classic movie Princess Bride. He's driven by revenge, and when he finally confronts his father's murderer, he keeps repeating, "My name is Inigo Montoya, prepare to die. My name is Inigo Montoya, prepare to die. My name is Inigo Montoya, prepare to die." The election poster reads, "Inigo Montoya, 20, for the year, prepare to die." Very funny. Finally, this last image is a photo of a platter of chocolate chip cookies, each one decorated with a white surgical mask. The image made me smile. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Both houses of Congress overwhelmingly approved a $3.8 billion aid package for Israel. $3.8 billion. It's called the National Defense Authorization Act. It passed the House by a vote of 295 to 125. That's nearly 3 to 1 in favor. Now, it passed the Senate by a vote of 86 to 14, which is 8.5 to 1.5 in favor. That's pretty impressive considering all the things that we're hearing about Israel. These are important numbers. They reflect a more true sense of support for Israel than the congressional rumblings we hear about. Some very proud members of Congress shout that the aid to Israel should have been linked and be in question, totally. That it should be a carrot and a stick, or both, forcing Israel's policies on numerous issues, especially those regarding the Palestinians and regarding and including annexation. According to these votes, those voices are still a very small minority. For instance, Senator Bernie Sanders as well as the Squad, you remember those 4 congresswomen, have been very vocal and led many to believe that Israel's support in Congress was waning. Members of Congress have their finger on the pulse. Okay, they know what's going on in their constituencies. On the one hand, they educate their constituencies, but they also vote their consciences very often. On the other hand, however, they would not take a stand that would jeopardize or threaten their electability. So if Israel was not a positive element within their voters' minds, they would not have voted so unanimously towards this. It's a very good sign, especially good because 2 of the 4 members of the Squad, Talib and Omar, faced very serious primary election challenges in early August. Relations between Iran and Iraq are in high gear. Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, recently visited Iraq. And a few days later, Iraq's foreign minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, visited Iran. Iranian President Rouhani described these visits as a turning point in their relationship, not just between 2 neighbors, but for the region. He said that Iran stands ready to protect its neighbor. After the meeting, and this is critical to see, after the Iraqi foreign minister met with the Iranian premier, President Rouhani, he said the following, quote, "We are certain that the visit will be a turning point in relations between the 2 countries. We still remain ready to stand by the Iraqi nation and apply efforts for stability and security in Iraq and the region." Kadhimi then responded that, and I'm quoting here, "Iraq will not allow the posing of any threat from its soil against Iran," unquote. He continued and said that Iraq is committed to, quote, "a balance and avoiding any alignment," unquote. There has been tremendous tension between Iran and Iraq. It now appears that they're warming and united. Meanwhile, the United States, which has a serious and significant presence in Iraq, is really in question now. All this is happening right under their nose. Twitter shuttered accounts of people who have a Star of David as part of their profile picture. Twitter informed account holders that the Star of David was hateful imagery. Several reported that they received a message from Twitter saying, "We've determined that this account violated Twitter rules, specifically for violating our rules against posting hateful imagery. You may not use hateful images or symbols in your profile image or profile header. As a result, we have locked your account," unquote. This move by Twitter is nothing short of absurd. It's not the first time it's happened. At one point, YouTube considered Zionism and Zionists to be hate words. You should know this as watchers of JBS, because JBS was shuttered at one point. I just did a Twitter search for the word swastika. There are thousands of pictures of anti-Semitic swastikas in Twitter as part of images. In fact, the first image was a person wearing a COVID face mask with a swastika. U.S. Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, arrived in Israel one recent morning. It was actually a Friday morning. The 4-star general flew directly into an Israeli Air Force base. Milley met with Aviv Kochavi, his Israeli counterpart. He also met with Yossi Cohen, the head of the Israeli Mossad. Defense Minister Benny Gantz came to the base, and he met with the American general also. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu met with Milley through a video conference. Kochavi was present and part of the conversation. Israel was the only destination of the United States general. This is important. So what did they talk about? There is only one answer, and that's Iran. They also spoke, in the context of Iran, of Syria and Hezbollah, and their involvement with Iran and Iran's involvement with Syria and Hezbollah. All the suspicious fires and explosions in Iran, they were certainly on the agenda. The U.S. Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff does not hop on a plane and make trips for no reason. This was a whirlwind visit. Milley came to Israel to deliver messages and to get information that could not be delivered in any other way. Not through the embassy, and certainly not through the internet or even a secure phone. Nothing is more secure than a face-to-face meeting. Sami Shukri, the foreign minister of Egypt took a quick helicopter ride to Ramallah to have a face-to-face conversation with PA President Abbas. He arrived after a short visit to Jordan. He flew from Amman, Jordan, to Ramallah. It's about a 20-minute helicopter ride. The obvious agenda was to discuss a response to Israel's plans to annex part of the West Bank. Egypt brainstormed on this, first with Amman and then with Ramallah, on how to activate international influence against Israel if they pursue annexation. The Arab world is deeply concerned about Israel's annexation plans. They are planning a response. All this Arab bluster may be a total waste of time. Israel's plan has not yet been articulated. So far, it's simply speculation. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquant piece of information. Did you know that the origin of the Star of David is certainly not King David? In Hebrew, it's called the Shield of David, or Magen David, also known as the Seal of Solomon. The Star of David's connection to the Jews and Israel really only dates back to the 17th century. That's only a few hundred years. Unlike the menorah, the shofar, the lulav, the lion, which are clearly biblical images, the star is not at all a biblical image. The symbol of Israel is not the Star of David, but rather the menorah. The star is on the flag of Israel, and that there's no question about. The six-pointed star has been in Kabbalistic materials and also in synagogues in Austria. Islamic and Moorish architecture use an overlapping set of two squares, that is 8-point stars instead of a 6-point star. The Star of David only moves to other locales, such as Poland and Russia, in the 19th century. It was chosen for the Zionist flag at the First Zionist Congress in 1897. Why? Precisely because it did not have any religious significance. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.